So now that we have an idea of kind of the terminology we're going to be using for the rest of the topic, let's kind of bring in the subject that we're interested in studying, right? And so for that, we kind of remind you of the first set of labs that we started off with, this idea of your microbiome, right? And part of the story that we're going to give you here is, remember that the organisms that are present on you, in you, within you, and so on and so forth, without causing any particular harm and possibly sometimes even giving you a benefit, you don't come with those. You acquire them. And so one of the things we get to kind of teach you about your defenses and disease is that technically, while you're inside your parent, in this case, so while you're in utero, you really have no organisms on you. You're technically nice and clean, right? Not a single bacterium, not a single organism is present on you aside from your own cells, right? What usually happens is that during birth, as you are being kind of expunged from your parent, in this case, you usually end up acquiring your very first set of organisms. And so if it is what we would call a natural birth, if you will, I know these definitions are a little bit loose, is that as you pass through the vaginal canal and you come out and take your very first fresh breath of actual air, in this case, you get exposed to your very first organism, which is a group of organisms known as lactobacillus, right? So the same ones that provide you with certain dairy products and cheeses and everything else, those are your very first exposure. Again, that's assuming it is done through natural means, not a cesarean section. Obviously, there are some differences that occur there, right? But your very, very first exposure to your very, very first organism, which happens to be lactobacillus, happens at birth. And then after that, then you start acquiring the rest as you're exposed to the rest of the world, right? So more air hits you, and as you start being paraded around for existing, then you start acquiring the rest of them in the order of trillions of them, right? But again, prior to this happening, the very first set you acquire comes from mom, technically, right? Now, keeping in mind that part of you acquiring this microbiome, it introduces one specific definition that you should know, is called colonization. And very much like something you've learned in like a history class, it's this idea that the organisms that are landing on you, these bacteria, fungi, and so on and so forth, are pretty much kind of establishing residence. They're kind of landing on you, in you, around you, whatever, but they're setting their little place to live without harming you, without causing you any disease, okay? That's this concept that organisms are going to live on you, around you, inside of you, and so on and so forth, without causing you any harm. And so this is this concept of colonization. So the very first set of organisms, including lactobacillus, are more or less colonizing you, right? And so ultimately, if they decide to stay there and you don't reject them, you don't get rid of them, they become part of your microbiome. They become part of that standard microbiota or standard microflora, the terms that are kind of interchangeable these days, but they become part of your microbiome. Now, also understanding that there are a few different organisms out there of what we would call transient, if you will, that sometimes they establish a temporary time, in this case, that sounds a little redundant, in which they can live on you without causing you harm and eventually leave. And so these can kind of cycle through our lifetime at times. Now, to kind of expand upon this concept of the microbiome, so this is not something I'm asking you to memorize, just kind of understand how powerful this exposure to other organisms is that we've now kind of come to the understanding that these organisms that are living in us, around us, without causing us harm, are truly essential to our survival. And so we truly shouldn't be trying to consider them these other external factors per se, rather than we should kind of truly integrate them as part of our understanding of what a human really is. We know from plenty of research that is out there that this group of organisms, this so-called microbiome, influences everything from your health. And we know, for example, that clearly most of you have heard in even just commercials that your gut microbiome, so the stuff that's living inside your large intestine or anything else, has a huge impact on how you feel, just more or less, right? What type of nutrients you're absorbing, whether you have diarrhea, and so on and so forth. But it's far more than that. We know that, for example, depending on what type of microbiome you've developed over your lifetime, these can be highly correlated with your propensities for obesity, for example. It can have an effect on how you age, more or less. And then there's plenty of evidence showing that, for example, certain types of organisms present within your gut can have or lead to a higher chance of you developing cancer, for example. We now know, and these are not listed here, that there's definitely links between what you eat and having headaches and migraines, for example, too. So clearly, it's more than just the fact that there's an organism living on you. These guys have this very powerful effect in terms of maintaining your health as well. And probably one of the ones that kind of gets established as part of this a lot, which truly has virtually almost no evidence to support it, is this concept of probiotics. And this idea that these organisms can be consumed in order to kind of maintain you at a state of health. And the problem is that most people forget that just because you're eating yogurt, which is typically where most of this is usually mentioned, is that it has to pass through your stomach. And unless these are specific bacteria that are acidophiles or acid resistant or acid tolerant, everything else you're consuming in whatever food or pill form, more likely than not, will be destroyed inside your stomach. So it really won't make it that far. So this concept of probiotics, more than anything else, has, as well it has been studied, hasn't really shown a lot of beneficial effects, simply because it doesn't just make it to its ultimate destination. Now, when you receive massive amounts of it in some sort of pill form, it is possible that it can make it to your large intestine and have some sort of benefit. But as of this moment, there are no solid or concrete evidence showing that consuming these things, consuming these products that are literally just being marketed towards you, will actually have a beneficial effect. Now, that being said, I will tell you that there is a slightly different interpretation of this, in which there has been some decent results shown. And this idea of changing your microbiome present in your gut does have an opportunity, if you will, to have an impact on your health. And this is a field of that has received relatively new prominence in the news and in the media, because it's a little strange. And strange simply because of the fact that most people haven't thought about this. This is the concept of a fecal transplant. This idea that rather than trying to consume the organisms that might be healthy for you, we're just going to integrate them inside of you, going through the colon itself. So rather than consuming it, these are introduced through an anal route. Now, what is happening here is this idea that we're trying to recolonize your colon by transferring organisms that are present in feces, ones that we believe or we think might be beneficial to you. And so there's a lot of issues that have to be considered here. Not only that these fecal transplants usually have to be done not only under very critical conditions, but also have to come from people that we know are healthy, and usually have to have some sort of relationship to you. That means they're coming from a brother or a sister or a parent that shares your genetics. But amongst these things, and as they have been performed in very few or limited cases, we have found out that a lot of people that have undergone these fecal transplants, that they have received some minor benefits. So anything from including things like reducing their headaches and propensity, to also having an effect on lactose intolerance. So there are the beginnings of data kind of displaying that being able to recolonize somebody's colon can have a significant effect on their health. And this includes things like celiac disease, for those people that literally have an allergy to the components of gluten, for example. So a lot of cool stuff is happening, but this is kind of a brand new field. And so we kind of need to study a little bit more. We need a little bit more data. But a lot of really cool stuff that our microbiome truly plays a much bigger role in our health than we usually give it credit to. So it's not just you, it's everything that's in you and around you without causing you harm that does have these possible benefits. So with this in mind, I want to kind of introduce this concept of what we call host relations. This idea that it's not you by yourself, it's not just the human, it's just not one organism, rather it's a collaboration between the host and other organisms like your microbiome keeping you healthy. So to understand this, allow me to kind of clarify some very, very common misconceptions of some terms. And I'm going to give you probably the biggest example shortly. Now, going back to this idea of your microbiome, this microflora or normal flora, one of the biggest contributors that you'll see in terms of health as we get into immunology is the fact that if they colonize on your body, so if they land there and live there without causing you any harm, one of the biggest things is this concept of I was there first. In other words, they will prevent the growth of pathogens, meaning that if they land on you, because you already have somebody there, they can't grow there either. So not only they prevent from pathogens from landing and trying to hurt you, but they also prevent them from overgrowing because your body has been already occupied. And so we know this as microbial antagonism. Another term that we usually use is something called competitive exclusion. And so again, this idea of I was there first, and no two particles can occupy the same space kind of idea too, is the fact that because you already have something living on your skin, other things can't land there and try and live there and take over. So they are antagonizing the ability for other organisms from landing and taking over too. So let me give you classic examples. E. coli, which happens to be present all over you, but also heavily present inside your large colon. For example, one of the things it does is to prevent other bad things from growing inside of your colon. It produces this little toxin called bactericin. It's part of those plasmids that we learned when we did topic D. And so not only is it kind of keeping you healthy by providing you vitamins and minerals and things like that too, but it's also preventing, it's literally fighting off other guys from growing inside your intestine. So it's literally preventing you from getting sick. Another common one that applies, for example, is Candida albicans. So this is a yeast in this case, which happens to be, what it does is that it thrives in an acidic environment. So what it does is as it grows, its environment becomes a little bit more acidic. And so unless most organisms are acidophiles, other things won't be able to grow around it. So Candida, what it does in this case, is that it kind of literally kind of excludes anything from growing simply because it changes its pH. And the pH of its environment, I'm sorry, I should state that. So because it's too acidic to live in, everything else just dies off. And so these are the benefits that we're getting from our microbiome, from our microflora. So to kind of establish what these guys can do, it's important to understand what type of relationships they can have between us and between them and us, for example. So let's start with the terminology associated with this, right? So the most common term that we will have is something called a symbiotic relationship. And contrary to popular belief, it doesn't mean what you think it means. Symbiosis by itself, so something that is symbiotic, typically means the relationship between two organisms, typically some sort of host and another, right? In which at least one of the organisms gets something out of it, okay? Now, it doesn't mean good, it doesn't mean bad, it just means one of the organisms is receiving some sort of benefit, which is contrary to what most people define even in movies when they say, oh, it's a symbiotic relationship. No, not quite. Here, all it means is that between two or more organisms, one of them is getting something out of it, okay? And so the most common one is called a commensal symbiotic relationship. We also refer to this as commensalism, if you want to hear this in full, in which you have organisms that are living on you, part of your microbiome, that they're doing nothing for you whatsoever. They're not harming you. They're not attacking you. You're not getting anything out of it, but they are. And so, for example, you have a class, genera of organisms called the Corynebacteria that live on your eyes, in which they kind of feed off of some of the things that you're producing from your eyeballs, as well as some of the things that land in your eyes. They feed off of it, but they don't cause you any harm nor give you any benefit. Okay. The same thing applies to, for example, your ears, and part of the general area, mycobacteria that is present in there also kind of are growing there. They're living, they're getting benefits, but they're not harming you, nor are you getting anything out of it. So this is called a commensal relationship. Okay, so this is called commensalism. They're just there, getting on their own, surviving on their own, and they're getting benefits, but you're not getting anything out of it. So this is the first type of symbiotic relationship, in which one organism benefits, the other one gets nothing out of it. Okay. Now, probably the one that most people use and unfortunately misuse the term symbiosis for is something called mutualism, or a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, in which, again, it's back to one organism benefiting, but in this case, both get something out of it. So it's mutually beneficial if you want to think about it that way, right? So here I can give you back to that example that I mentioned behind E. coli, which usually inside your intestines, not only is it getting food that it's getting from your processing, but also it will provide you with certain vitamins like vitamins B and K, certain types of A's, D's, E's, and so on and so forth, that it will produce and you'll absorb as a result of it consuming some of those nutrients. So both organisms benefit. Not only the host gets something out of it, but also the colonizing organism as well. So when both of them get something out of it, this is called a mutualistic relationship. So this is referred to as mutualism, or again, a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. And here's where that difference gets to be established. Most people assume that symbiosis means that. That is not true. A symbiotic relationship just means two organisms coming together in which one gets something out of it. And again, a common misconception of symbiosis. And here's the bigger kicker, in which we even tell you that basically parasitism, so parasites, if you will, are also a symbiotic relationship. Remember, at least one organism benefits, so that still fits the case. Parasitic relationships, or parasitism, if you will, are the relationships in which one organism benefits, but the other one gets harmed. So now we're establishing this case in which it's a symbiotic relationship, but one is getting something out of it, the other one is getting hurt. Something is being damaged, something's being lost, possibly even killed. So there are three types of symbiotic relationships, which is what we're summarizing at the bottom over there, in what you see from your textbook, actually, in which we establish a commensal relationship in which one benefits and the other one just nothing happens to it, a mutualistic relationship in which both organisms are getting something out of it, and then a parasitic one, which again is a symbiotic relationship as well, and this idea that one benefits and the other one hurts, or something is losing something out of it. Now, that being established, it's kind of important to remind you that you're not alone. No matter how alone you may feel right now, trapped at home sometimes, is that there are anywhere between 20 to possibly 80 trillion organisms living on you right now, in, around you, inside of you. And most of them are either not causing you any harm, or some of them are even giving you some benefits. And so here's a very short list of these. These are the most common ones that we've established. You don't need to memorize them. It's just more of an example, in which we show you that, for example, plenty of organisms present on your skin are out there, lots of them in most of your epithelial tissues from your eyes, nose, throat, mouth, and so on and so forth. They're all there, and including part of your reproductive and urinary systems. Now, you'll notice that some of them are highlighted a little bit in red. And so here, one of the differences is that there are certain differences between the biological sexes, for example. So there are small differences between those that basically have a penis versus a vagina, if you want to think about it that way. So there are certain differences in organisms that grow there between each of the types of organisms that we're seeing here. But regardless, you have tons of these growing on you. They're always there. Most of them are not causing you any harm. Most of them are just kind of living there doing their own thing. And some of those are even giving you some benefits out of that. So specifically those of the reproductive system, which is what I was kind of focusing on there, they truly kind of prevent the growth of other ones. So they are acting like anti-STDs, if you really want to think about it that way, or anti-STIs, I should say, in which they're preventing the overgrowth of other organisms, other bacteria, other yeasts, other fungi that might be trying to get in there and harm you. These guys are protecting you. Now, with that being said, believe it or not, there is one more type of relationship that in this case is not symbiotic. Rather here, this is what we call an opportunistic relationship. And what we're seeing here is that sometimes those guys that are innocuous, the ones that are kind of not doing anything to you, they're not harming you, they can kind of turn on you. And so that means that they can become pathogenic if you allow them to do so. And so these are referred to as opportunistic relationships in which an organism becomes bad, becomes pathogenic, simply because of some certain conditions. And those can be anything from the fact of where you find them, to the amount of how much is growing of them, to the point of you being having some sort of immunocompromisation or your immune system being a little bit more weaker than usual and allows their overgrowth. Probably one of the most common ones, for example, is the Staphylococcus species that you have on your skin. Most of them that are living in there are not doing absolutely anything to you. They're just living there, getting some food and living on without causing any harm. However, if you get a cut, for example, if you have a nice little wound on your skin and those guys enter the bloodstream, they can feasibly turn pathogenic, and anything from a septic shock or causing septicemia to even a heart attack, for example, just because of the location. Just because it's okay living on your skin doesn't mean it's good for it to be inside your blood. And so there's plenty of examples of this. So they become pathogenic when given the chance. So this is called an opportunistic type relationship. So continuing on with the subject, now that we understand this idea that there are different levels of relationships between being symbiotic or opportunistic, and some of them giving us benefits and some of them possibly hurting, really we're going to look at the parasitic ones. We're going to look at the ones that harm us. And so that's the subject of, again, pathology as well as immunology. And so to start with that, we begin with one of those definitions that we kind of introduce in the subject, this idea of what we call etiology. And the concept here is what we're trying to demonstrate is that we're trying to understand the cause of a disease. Where does it come from? Why does it do it? How does it do it? When does it do it? And so on and so forth, right? And so for this, we kind of introduce the subject that you are already familiar with. It's called Koch's postulates, this idea that we want to confirm that there is a cause behind a certain disease. And so to introduce this subject fully, we kind of bring in this kind of model, if you will, of how a disease takes place. And so we refer to something called a triad, which we kind of usually end up kind of demonstrating this kind of cool little triangle type of model, if you will, in which there's three things required for disease to take place in this case, or at least a pathological or pathogenic disease. So when an organism is trying to cause you harm. And so we refer to three things in which we need an agent, for example, that is going to be the one that causes our challenge away from health, right? We need to have a host that is able to take on this agent, so what we call a susceptible host, right? But more than anything else, as obvious as this may seem, you need to have an environment that brings both the agent and the host together. So we define the cause of disease, we establish a cause of disease as the interaction of the agent and the host whenever there is an environment that allows it. Now, this may sound very, very kind of almost intuitive or very easy to understand, but it's a very, very important concept. So without the proper environment, there cannot be disease. And allow me to make it in a very simplistic, almost kind of jokish kind of way. Think about it this way. Let's think about an Ebola virus as being the agent and you being the host, right? And what would be the environment that brings you to it? And so one of the kind of current situations is that thankfully, Ebola as a disease and the virus itself are restricted to very, very specific regions, to the continent of Africa specifically, right? And so the idea is that you need to be in that environment. So that means that, as dumb as this may sound, that you will not get Ebola, for example, unless you're in that environment. So you are not likely to catch Ebola, basically, simply because there's no environment that brings you and that agent together. And I know it sounds very kind of intuitive, very kind of easy to understand, but that's an important concept, because from the standpoint of medicine, from the standpoint of epidemiology, what we're going to try and do is prevent that environment from occurring, right? And it could be anything from your almost basic concept of a parent, in which tells you, well, if you do something and it hurts, we'll stop doing it. That's kind of that same level of understanding. And so whenever there's an environment that brings the agent and the host together, there is this kind of final test in which the environment, even though it brings you guys together, brings the agent and the host, it really depends on the strength, the virulence of the agent, as well as the strength of the host and its ability to fight back, to determine whether disease is going to occur. Just because somebody sneezed in your face doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get sick. Just because the environment came together, so you, for whatever reason, you're running outside, going into Walmart because you need to buy toilet paper or something of that sort, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get sick. Even though you and the agent have come together in the same environment, it really depends on which one is stronger. So it becomes almost this kind of little seesaw or teeter-tot kind of effect, on which, depending on which one is stronger, it will win over the other, right? So this is the subject of etiology, this idea of what brings the agent and the host together, so the environment, and which one of those two has the advantage over the other that ultimately will lead to disease. And so for those of you who remember, again, back the very first day of our class, we talked about this subject of how do we know that one of them is causing the other. And so this goes back to Koch's postulates, talking about this idea of confirming whether or not an organism causes disease, transferring it to a healthy environment, or possibly like a Petri plate like we do in the lab, to confirm the identity of the organism, right? That's kind of how we establish that etiology. Not only the agent, so we confirm that that's the one that is causing the possible disease or producing a toxin and so on and so forth, but also what environment brought them together. So that's the subject of etiology. And so we're going to start integrating it into everything we're going to be studying from this point on, right?